So we are eager to hear your presentation, Derek. Thank you, welcome.
All right, thank you. I've got a little cold, so excuse my voice. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation, and this is great to be here. I have been developing these methods for a while now, probably 12, 13 years I've been working on methods development, and originally started where I was reading books about and articles about new kind of case study methods, but nobody told me really how to do it. And so I started working on it, but also using it in my own research. And I would say I don't think you can develop a method unless you're also using it and also figuring out all of the difficulties and challenges and then trying to find answers to those. And then some years ago I started, so my substantive work is on the European Union. I study policy-making processes, in particular at the highest level around the European Council. But I started becoming interested in evaluation as a more applied research tool, and I've been lucky to be able to interact with some really smart people in the evaluation field, and also do evaluations. So I'm just coming. I have a little bit of my bad conscience. I have a revision that I have to do of one of the two case studies that I just did for the Joint Data Center, which is this UNHCR World Bank collaboration, where I was looking at how socioeconomic data could influence policy, and the cases were Colombia and Kenya. So I've been doing evaluation using these methods and trying to adapt them to different types of evaluation settings. My primary kind of focus has been on more development, but there's no reason why I don't think you can use these methods for other types of questions. So just what I was going to just kind of give you a brief introduction to kind of the gist of process tracing, and then also some ideas if you are interested in them, where you could go, but also to be able to understand what are the findings, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this kind of method, because I have also seen as kind of a external to some evaluation projects where people say that they're doing process tracing, and yeah. But also commissioners. I think it's important to think about there's multiple methods that answer different questions. So your RCTs, your experiments, field trials, whatever, are great, but they answer one type of question. They don't answer, it's not one size fits all. So process tracing in particular, the core is it's asking, how did it work? This is a quote from some colleagues who work in the policy kind of studies field, where they say that policymakers need a realistic causal theory about what occurs when policy tools are deployed and how it occurs, if they want to design something that will actually happen more often than not, and to escape the trap of poorly conceived and related tacit knowledge, experience, and heuristics. Okay, this is of course focused on policy design, so kind of the front end, and evaluation of course comes at the back end after a project. But I think the idea that we learn how it worked in a case, we learn how an intervention actually produced a contribution, is very important knowledge, and it can supplement other types of methods, be they interviewing using OECD back criteria, or if you're doing a field trial, whatever. They're answering different questions. Your experiment or your RCT is not going to tell you how it works. It tells you it made a difference. Of course, you could do process tracing on the side in some of the cases. That's perfectly fine. But it doesn't answer, again, your RCT doesn't answer all the questions. So process tracing is a theory-based evaluation, as Marcus also just alluded to. in particular, I think has strengths in looking at more intangible interventions. So I was a fellow at the IEG, the Independent Evaluation Group, last spring, and I would be going around and talking to lots of people within the World Bank, and it was really interesting the amount of people that were quite frustrated with existing methods because they felt that a lot of the important work that the bank actually did in policy dialogue with governments, it simply was not being evaluated. And of course, if it's not being evaluated, it's not being appreciated. And at the end of the day, it's not something you're encouraged to do. There are things that are easily measurable, but it's not necessarily the interesting things that are easily measurable. What process tracing has the promise of doing, it's very difficult to do, I'll just put that out there. But it has the promise that, for example, I've just done 2 studies where I've tried to figure out how the dialogue between the World Bank, UNHCR, and the Colombian and Kenyan governments respectively, how did that actually work? How did they actually, well, in the one case in Colombia, they actually succeeded. Colombian migration policy vis-a-vis the Venezuelans was shaped by analytical products that the World Bank, and I can provide both the how and evidence for that there's a considerable amount of policy influence. And that's in theory then things that you could learn from. You can't, of course, repeat it one for one. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but you can be then inspired. So I think that's one of the things, is a lot of things that we do and we evaluate are not necessarily very easily measurable. I mean, it's easy to measure, you build a school or you build a road, but it's much more difficult to investigate some of these more intangible interventions. And I also think it can, in theory at least, increase the policy relevance of projects by learning how it actually worked and where it works. Then we can learn from that. And in theory, if you have evidence, good access to evidence, you can make some pretty strong causal inferences. Those of you that are trained to think in RCTs would say, well, I don't have any variation. How can I make causal inference? Well, we're making causal inference in the same way that we would make inferences in a criminal investigation. Right? There we have a theory of the crime, and then we have evidence for it. And it's in particular the activities that are linking, in a crime, some kind of motivation, and then the actual crime. Here, some kind of intervention and contribution. The activities, the interaction between program actors and then different target actors, and what people are doing in their interaction. That's what we would be wanting to evidence empirically. And then based on that, if we do have, again, relatively good access to evidence, you can make, to varying degrees, a causal inference based on that, depending upon how strong the evidence is. Of course, it might be, well, you've just made it a little bit more plausible. I think that's what I was able to do in my Colombian case study. I was only able to say, through interviews, document analysis, that it was quite plausible that the World Bank analytical products and the dialogue shaped the final policy that the Colombian government decided. Ideally, I would have had even stronger access. I would have had all of the internal policy briefs and drafts, etc., on the Colombian side. I was unfortunately, I kept on pushing for it, I was never able to get it. So I could have maybe made some stronger causal inferences if I had that access. The trade-offs are time and resources, but I don't think this is actually that much of a trade-off. It's no different. For those of you that have done a good field trial, it's really difficult to design good research. I think where the core difference between something like an RCT, where you spend so much time thinking about the design, what is the treatment that you're giving, how can we get controlled variation, You spend a lot of time thinking about the design, whereas process tracing is more like a kind of a continual process. It's more like the detective that's going out and trying to explore kind of an interaction between initial hypotheses about how a process worked and then the actual empirics that are being found. One of the other trade-offs is limited scope. But again, I don't think that this is necessarily something that is different than an RCT. Because Nancy Cartwright tells us, a philosopher of science who's done some work in evaluation, she said, your RCT tells you, your experiment tells you, it works on average somewhere. Right? How do I know if it's going to work here? And of course, it's an average. So how do you actually use that knowledge? You know it works on average, but there's probably a lot of cases where it doesn't work very well. And it can be really difficult to get a large scope of our findings. In the same way with process tracing, you learn how it works in one case, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's one size fits all. So it can be very different. Process tracing is on, I think this was in the quiz yesterday, this tree, for those of you who were at the dinner. And the methods branch, we have theory-based evaluation approaches and then impact evaluation approaches. And so process tracing is one variant of a theory-based evaluation approach. Process tracing, then, if we're going to talk about what is a process, it's a bit different than realist evaluation, where we talk about behavioral mechanisms. Whereas process tracing is a lot more like contribution analysis, where you try to unpack what is going on in between your process, your mechanism is everything linking the intervention and a contribution. And that's a different way of thinking about mechanisms. It's also, in contrast to realist evaluation, it's also a case-based approach, which means that for example, we typically study a positive case. Okay. The three core elements, some of it's just coming out of the name. Process. What are we tracing? We're tracing a causal process. Okay, that's kind of tautological. I'll tell you a little bit about what a process theory of change is then, and in particular the key difference between contribution analysis and process tracing. The empirical analysis is then using observational traces of activities, people doing things that link an intervention and an outcome together. And then the final element, where we're not very good at yet, is how we can actually learn from case studies, thinking about context and comparing across cases. Okay, just going to real briefly dig into each of these. So realist evaluation mechanisms are unobservable, typically black boxed. Contribution analysis gets a little closer to process tracing, but the core difference, if I was going to flag one thing, is that the linkages that we want to trace in process tracing are treated as assumptions in contribution analysis, which means they're typically not studied empirically in an active sense. So that's where, we try to make explicit and empirically observable the causal linkages. So for example, a theory of change in realist evaluation would have these mechanisms. These are behavioral encouragement, motivation, for example, but they're kind of divorced from actual activities. And also that means that I'm not sure exactly, I don't know, there's people that really like realist evaluation and it's great, I'm not bashing it, I'm just saying that for me, the kind of research question that I want, the how does it work, I want to try and get a little bit closer to tracing what people are actually doing. Contribution analysis gets a little bit closer to this, links inputs and activities with outputs, outcomes, and impacts, including the assumptions underlying linkages. So these linkages, again, are treated as assumptions. Those are what we want to unpack in process tracing. So just as an example, this is, we have an activity, training about nutrition benefits offered to mothers. We have an impact, child's nutrition status and health has improved. And then we have outputs, outcomes. And then the actual linkages then are treated, this is from John Main, some of his work on contribution analysis, are treated as assumptions. Whereas in process tracing, you would want to go a little bit more into, like, how does the training actually work? Like, how does that actually lead mothers to acquire new knowledge? Of course, anybody that's actually taught knows that it's by no means easy to teach. And it might be interesting to learn about what these people were actually doing. Is this just a one-off, or is it a longer process? Here, I don't know. Yeah, so idea in process tracing is investigating how things work, and in particular, trying to understand, unpack, and evidence the causal linkages between an intervention. So you're using a process theory of change, and time's short, so I'll just push into just as an example. So this could be one plausible pathway, where here I'm trying to actually unpack how the teaching works and how we're interacting with these mothers. And it's an iterated process. So the teacher's providing mothers with bite-sized, easily understandable lessons that are sold as having worked in a similar context. Because they're sold as it worked, over there in that village, you can do it here, and it's easy to do. They're little lessons. The mother then thinks, okay, well, I'll try. And see what happens. And then she goes home and she does it. Oh wow, it actually worked. Our food tastes a little better, or the kids have a little more energy. Great, I'm going to return to class. So here, again, this is just a simple hypothetical. But the idea would be that we're trying to unpack what was going on in that arrow between activities and outputs. What we're trying to do here is saying, how does it actually work? How does the teaching actually deliver? Like, what are the teachers doing? What are the motivations of the mothers? What are people doing in the process? And that's kind of the gist of, at the theoretical level, what process tracing is. So our process theories of change, this is language from Nancy Cartwright, which I like, and I think it's process tracing, it's an analytical simplification of a process. And in particular, what you are doing when you're theorizing is you're not having everything included. You're focusing on key interactions between program actors and target actors where the challenges and barriers to results are overcome. So then we make explicit the actors, who's doing something, the actions, and I say the causal principles are kind of because, that we also want to try to evidence empirically. So when we theorize, for example, we would assess the policy context, what's a potential contribution. We try and figure out actually what was the intervention that could trigger people to respond in particular ways. Often we'll find when we're thinking about kind of gaming through from an intervention, what kind of contribution. What we have in our policy program documents might not be actually what is the actual contribution. Often we have very unrealistic ideas about the contribution that could have been produced by a given intervention. What's the contribution pathway? And then you unpack it empirically and theoretically. So you engage in a back and forth between empirics and your theory. So you typically would start with like a sketch. You probably need to know a little bit about what's going on in a given intervention. So maybe initial field work, you develop a sketch of your process theory, and then you use that then to go out and probe, do I find things that resonate with that theory, or did it work in different ways? So it's this, called in methodological terms, an abductive research process, where we're learning about how it actually worked through this juxtaposition between our theoretical ideas and our empirics. Okay. How do we trace it? Well, we're not using counterfactual comparisons. We're using what could be called process or mechanistic evidence. So process evidence is observational empirical material left by activities and linkages. So the core thing with process tracing is it's people doing things, and because people do things, that can leave traces that we can follow. So for example, World Bank, great. You put forward an analytical report and you sell it to the Colombian government. Okay, well that might then leave traces, both the actual report going over, but in subsequent documents. Now I've seen in quite a few different evaluations when I did work like this for the bank, that there was a lot of echoes. Like, so once that report was there, then in subsequent, Colombian or Moroccan policy documents, I was seeing echoes. Like sometimes just thing cut and pasted over into the national policy documents. That would be those kind of observational traces that we're looking for. And then their inferences are based on the correspondence between expected and what we actually find. Very briefly, in process tracing, you would have a broader understanding of evidence, much more like in a criminal investigation. It's basically anything that tells us something. So it could be patterns, media communication patterns over time, sequences, people, events in a particular sequence. It could be just a document existing, might be evidence of, depending upon your process theory, or what we typically think about as evidence as accounts, what actors tell us, content of documents. But the point being here is there's a lot of different other types of evidence that can be relevant. So also being creative. So then we work with process evidence, the observable manifestations of activities of parts of a process. And I'm not going to actually, this is very short and I want to have time for questions, but just really briefly, saying that process tracing offers a way of transparently and systematically evaluating your evidence using Bayesian logic. EBA has a great, if you really want to dig into the Bayesian side of process tracing, has a great, quite technical study that they commissioned by Barbara Bafani that kind of deals with the evidential side of process tracing. But the point is that, like, for example, we have an actor engaging in activity, we have evidence in theory, there's then certain questions that we would want to ask in relation to, do I have to find it? If I find it, are there alternative explanations for find it? That determines the confirming and disconfirming power of evidence. And then the actual more source-critical working with sources are, our interviews. Typically, process tracing, I would say, is a framework that helps you go beyond just talking to stakeholders. Stakeholders have a stake in things. How can we trust them? Well, that's a good question. And I think thinking through creatively about other types of evidence can help us corroborate or disconfirm what we're finding in our interviews with stakeholders. So evidence is evaluated through using Bayesian logic, which is basically a logical framework to ask the right questions. And in particular, it tells us about probative value, the power of specific items of evidence to increase or decrease our confidence in a specific claim. So it could be expect to see, which would be if you have to find it, you need to find it, you don't find it, there's some degree of disconfirmation. If you love to find it, it's really theoretically unique. It might be almost like a signature. There's not a lot of good alternative explanations for finding it. That would be strongly confirmatory. So evidence can be both confirmatory, disconfirmatory to different degrees. But Bayesian logic cannot stand alone. It needs to be coupled with a process theory that's then able to answer the question, which I think is one of the strengths of process tracing, is forcing ourselves to be explicit about, okay, what's this empirical material? What is it actually evidence of? And it's that simplified process theory that we're working with. And we avoid confirmation bias by assessing alternative explanations then of evidence. And if your P-talk is not supported empirically, you should revise it to what actually happened. And then, yeah, the level of confirmation, disconfirmation can vary depending upon the strength of the evidence. I think I'm going to jump over this slide and just say that just 2 seconds on case selection, and then I'll stop. Is the process tracing, so in theory there's 4 different types of cases, right? There's where we have our cause, known context, present, so here this would be an intervention. We have an outcome, some kind of contribution, at least in theory, could be present. And process tracing is really interested in what you could call typical cases or positive cases. So there's no reason to trace a process in a case where, per definition, we know, like the irrelevant case, There's no intervention. Well, there's no process then to trace. The contribution, we might be up there in that deviant case coverage. The contribution might occur, but then maybe somebody else is doing it if we didn't intervene. So process tracing is in particular interested in the positive cases, and then once we understand the positive cases, we've done some comparison of a couple cases, figuring out, well, did it work in similar ways? Then deviant cases where it should have worked and it broke down can be really interesting. But on the more comparative side of it, that's, I think, actually drawing lessons out and seeing how far they travel. That's something that process tracing actually right now is not very strong on. Okay, I promised to be short, so I think I will stop there so that there's plenty of time for...
Thanks a lot. I think we do like this.
Thank you.